he every day for the past few weeks he's been joining me for meetings. I don't really know why, but I'm not going to complain.
Well, cats are social beings. They also want to be in the meeting.
Apparently.
Surprised mine hasn't, because for some reason he always knows when a camera's running, and then he just runs into the room and sits in front of it.
Yeah. Once I bring the turtles on camera, then you know that I have a problem, that I need help.
Oh, the turtles. I didn't know you had turtles as well.
Yeah, cats and reptiles. It's a wonderful mix.
All right, so Stephen, I think this is yours.
Are you sharing your screen?
Oh, I'm not sharing my screen? Okay, then let me share my screen. There's this button here.
Are we streaming?
We are. Let me actually share the other screen. This is the one. So the internet can already see what you can't see, but now you should also be able to see it.
So basically ignore everything in this thread other than what's at the very top, which is in .NET Core 3, I think it was, maybe 2.1, we exposed a safe handle for socket. But you kind of can't do anything with it other than pass it around, maybe extract the file descriptor or handle from it, and p-invoke with it. If you get a handle from somewhere else, such as if you p-invoke to something like socket pair, or you p-invoke to socket and on Linux and pass in, create your own socket for some Linux specific protocol, you have no way to then use the rest of the socket class and infrastructure with that. So this is just adding a constructor to socket that takes an existing handle. There are, for the most part, everything works as you would expect it to. There are, some expected oddities and some unexpected oddities. Obviously, an expected oddity, which happens anywhere else we deal with handles, if someone were to pass in, a bad one, for example, one that was already closed, someone was, working with the raw handle or file descriptor, closed it, and then passed it in here, you might have handle recycling and all that kind of stuff, but that's just the nature of handles. The slight oddities are specific to the public APIs on the socket class, where if you take, for example, there's a property socket.blocking, which on socket defaults to true. On Windows, there's no way to query whether a socket has been put into non-blocking mode, at least not as far as I'm aware, whereas there is on Linux. And so if someone passed in a handle that they had made non-blocking, we're still going to reflect it as socket.blocking equals true on Windows, because we just have no way to get the actual value. You can work around that if you know you're in that situation by toggling it yourself, and then it'll kind of, snap back into the right thing. But there'll be a few things like that where we lack the ability to grab the exact data to, if you created, in a certain way, to fully round trip the information. But all the APIs like write, send and receive, all just work.
So that begs the question whether we should make blocking a parameter to that constructor, though, right? To tell the person, like, sorry, we can't produce this. You have to tell us.
We could. There's a variety of properties like that where we can't necessarily infer it on all platforms. Like on Mac, on Windows and Linux, we can infer the protocol type, but we can't always, or generally, we can't on Mac. So would we also take the protocol type? And what happens if we, on Linux, we can infer it. What happens if you pass in a different one from the one that we inferred? Do we throw? But we wouldn't do that on Windows because we couldn't infer it. So my default was, let's just do the best we can and leave it to docs. If people think we should try and have people pass in all the parameters and then we sort of do something else, we could consider it. I just don't know what that something else would be.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that it's like, given that we know investing analyzers, my question would be, how could we help people, right? So if we don't have a dedicated API, it would be relatively hard for us to detect, oh, you are on Windows, but so you're passing a socket handle, but you're not setting blocking.
Well, you can always create a socket, right? We all have constructors that if you want to, for a given family, you can create a socket. So this is only for special cases where, for example, you pass descriptors between processes or you try to work with unsupported address family. That all that stuff is kind of advanced. And if you want to just use normal constructor, you can, right?
Steve, can we make the properties throw if someone tries to get them and we don't know what they are?
I'm sure we could.
For the address families, we already have unknown, so I think that's default. That if you do not know, you just get address family unknown. I think the blocking is the only one weird case, and it's only on Windows, so...
So maybe I'm misunderstanding. Is the problem only that you can't ask the socket instance, or is the problem that the behavior of the socket instance isn't what you want it to be for the given handle?
If you access socket.getBlocking, we don't know what to return. So like by default, if you would do that, we don't actually query the underlying file descriptor or handle. We just know that, sorry, let me back up. If you create a socket just using the socket Win32 function or the POSIX API, it defaults to being blocking mode. We know that in the socket implementation, and so we maintain our own shadow copy of that information, a field that says whether it's blocking mode or not, which defaults to true. So if you just call get blocking, it's going to return true. If you have set it to false, then we'll not only make the syscall to move it into a non-blocking mode, but we'll set our property, our field to false, and then next time you access it, you'll get the value of the field, which is false. If you construct it from an arbitrary file descriptor or handle, and we lack the ability to ask the operating system, is this blocking or non-blocking, we kind of have no other option but to assume it's the default, and so we leave our field set to true. If we do have the ability, then we can query the operating system and set the field appropriately. Now, even then, it's a little weird because on Linux, where we do have the ability to query, or on Unix in general, where we have the ability to query, we actually the way we implement asynchrony for sockets is by putting the underlying file descriptor into a non-blocking mode, and then layering on sort of the asynchrony ourselves via trying the operation, getting a would block, and using poll to wait for the operation in a scalable way. That means that we actually on purpose diverge the state that we maintain in socket for socket.blocking from the underlying file descriptor. So if you were to take one socket, put it into non-blocking, say if you create a socket on Linux and just make an asynchronous method call on that socket, socket.blocking for that socket will return true, but the underlying file descriptor will be non-blocking. If you were to then take that SafeSocketHandle and use it to create another socket instance, when we query the underlying file descriptor, we'll find out that it's non-blocking. So we'll say that socket.blocking is false, even though the original instance on which it was created had it as true. So there's kind of no perfect answer. Yeah.
Anyway, setting it after you create the socket, it's not much worse than doing constructor with a bunch of parameters, right? This is really the most weird property. And again, I think as you suggested, Steve, I think we can document that.
Yeah.
This is an advanced use API, so expecting people to understand and read documentation, I think, is okay.
I mean, I don't know whether I agree with that statement, because advanced or not, right? People rarely read documentation until stuff doesn't work, right? The problem is that stuff only doesn't work on certain operating systems, right? Which is the whole point where we try to design APIs that they work across as much as we can by default, right? I mean, there's of course always gotchas, and you're always expected to test stuff, but in practice, people don't test on operating systems all the time, right? So my question was basically like, if we have cases like this, how can we at least provide an analyzer that would tell you that the stuff is no longer portable because you didn't do something correctly, right? I mean, we could, like if we make a constructor of, let's say, nullable parameters, at least we can detect that, oh yeah, you said null, which means, we infer it if we can, and if we can't, then too bad. Then we can tell people like, sorry, you passed a null here. Probably that code is no longer portable to Windows. So think about that. Or you did this thing, maybe it's no longer portable to Mac, to this other thing, right?
But to Tomáš's point, like, how would that be different from just if someone wanted to avoid an issue with such an analyzer, just have the very first thing they do after creating the socket be to set blocking equals true?
Oh, it doesn't. But at least at least something gave you the information that if you don't set it, we have no way of knowing. If you statically know the value is true, then by all means set it to true, right? Like that's domain knowledge that we just can't have, right?
Sorry, let me rephrase my question. Are you suggesting that because there's an optional parameter to the constructor, that would inform someone that there might be something that's happening?
Well, not that it's optional, right? In conjunction with an analyzer, right? So like the analyzer would tell you that, oh, you call this API, you pass a null for this parameter, that code is no longer portable. If you want the code to be portable, pass in the correct value for this parameter, right? So this would be the message we give people.
But how is so let's say I pass in a true or false to that parameter. How is that different from saying after the constructor socket.block?
It's not. That's what I'm saying. To me, the question is just what's easier for the analyzer, right? Like if you have a different property, it can be easily correlated information or not. I suppose we can.
In terms of analyzers, I would expect this to be very low clarity, so I don't know if we should go into this assuming there will be one.
Yeah, I'm honestly, I'm bringing it up in full disclosure, but I'm not particularly concerned about we are being blocked.
So, if it's just a reporting problem, which is what it sounds like it is for Windows, then I can kind of decide that I don't care, and that we could fix it in the future. But if you have a socket on Linux and you grab the handle and then you open a new one from that handle and it changes behavior, then we shouldn't add the API. Either it becomes a mandatory parameter of you have to say if you want it in blocking mode or not, or we just don't add it.
I don't think I agree.
Because diagnostically lying is one thing, because I don't think people are really going to read the property back and care. But if non-blocking is maintained on Windows and Mac, or is maintained on Windows, then they're going to expect that it's maintained. Like you tested async, it looks async, everything's happy. Then different things happen when you go to Linux. Like that to me is worse than the Windows behavior.
I don't think it would change behavior, would it, Steve?
The socket won't change. Well, it could change behavior. So if I have socket 1 on Linux and I make an asynchronous, okay. So here I'm going to first answer the question and then make a suggestion. If I have socket 1 that I make an asynchronous operation call on, its socket blocking is going to be true. The underlying file descriptor will be non-blocking. If I then make a synchronous call on that socket, we will respect the socket.blocking equals true and will simulate the synchrony, even though the file descriptor is non-blocking. So we'll still make the operation complete synchronously and successfully, even though the underlying now non-blocking. If you then just make a read call on it, it's going to fail with E would block, because its socket blocking property is going to be false rather than true, if assuming we query the underlying file descriptor. So one solution to that is to just say we always create the socket with a blocking equals true in our sort of managed view of the world. We still query to understand whether the underlying socket is non-blocking or not. And regardless of OS, when you then construct this thing from another socket, you're going to get socket.blocking equals true. And if the underlying socket was async on Linux, then will simulate the blocking.
That's at least consistent.
There's still corner cases, but
yeah. Then it's consistent, and consistency is good.
But not. I mean, there are still some inconsistencies that we can't do anything about. Like on Windows, if you took socket 1, made it socket.blocking equals false, and then use that SafeSocketHandle to create a second socket, we have no way of knowing what the underlying socket is. So we're shooting in the dark as to whether it's blocking or not.
So you could set it to blocking.
I was about to say, yeah, you can always set it to blocking.
But then we're actually mutating the underlying handle.
Yeah.
So I don't think we want to do that either. But I understand the concerns, Jeremy. At the same time, I think the benefits of such an API outweigh the concerns. So saying we're just not going to add it because there are some oddities, I don't think is the right answer. I think that's shooting ourselves in the foot.
I just felt like maybe it's like crypto stuff. If you only actually have like 7 customers and they'll all read the docs and understand it, and it's fine. I feel that I can't load the state machine here in my head, and therefore I don't think that the average caller could either.
Well, the average caller isn't going to access the relevant properties. But even if they couldn't, the only other answer is you need to write platform-specific code for every platform you want to target in order to p-invoke and re-implement the entire system.net.sockets infrastructure to be able to use arbitrary socket file descriptors you get.
And I guess really there's not much scenario in you have a socket instance, so you're in .NET, and you get the handle, and then you make a new one.
No, there's almost no. I mean, there's almost.
You should have just stuck with the same instance.
Right. There's almost no reason to take the SafeSocketHandle from one socket and use it to create another. The primary scenario here is you do something via pinvoke or native code that gives you a handle or file descriptor, and you use it to construct the socket.
Right. And in that case, I guess it makes more sense. I just started with your premise of we exposed this and then there was nothing you could do with it. And so now I was just picturing you have a socket and you're cloning the socket by handle, right. But that's actually bad because modifying one will modify the other in ways that we still can't express.
Right. Like one thing you might do with it is, send it across a Unix domain socket or something to some other process, or use this on Windows with duplicate or whatever that API is. Yeah. But the primary use cases for this are I'm p-invoking, or in some native code I'm creating, I'm calling some API that gives me back a socket file descriptor or handle, and now I want to use the managed socket class to wrap it.
Okay. And the socket handle class is publicly constructible?
Yes.
Okay.
For example, as part of another bug fix that caused me to look at this, I'm 90% sure we're going to change process.start to use socket pair instead of pipe to create the connection to the new process that you start. And it'd be really nice if we could then create a socket for the client to communicate over rather than not.
Okay, so given that the scenario is you've already done some p-invokes to build the handle yourself, and now you're turning it into socket semantics, then I'd say it makes a lot more sense than what I was originally thinking. And then I would recommend.
I think that's reasonable. I think it's reasonable to say that whenever you create a managed socket instance, socket.blocking returns true. On Linux and Mac, we can detect whether the underlying one is async and do the right thing. The only oddity there will be on Windows, and we just have no way of knowing.
Could you figure it out on Like, is it if you call the synchronous one, it'll give an error, and then the property would flip essentially the first time you call read, and it figures out it needs to go to the other mode?
Yes, except the problem is that any operation we perform on the socket has the potential to change state. So the only way to know would be, for example, to do a read or a write.
Yeah, I'm saying like put read. So if read and write are in, like, I'm waiting to figure out what state the socket was actually in mode, and then it figures out, oh crap, it's actually non-blocking. I'll flip the property and my behavior.
Right, but in order to do that, we'd have to actually read, which would take data off the socket.
Right. I mean, wait until somebody actually calls read. Like,
oh, and then flip. Well, even then, if the data was already available, it will still return successfully, even if it was a non-blocking.
Fair enough. Okay. My recommendation would be, if you can get eventually consistent, do that.
we certainly could. We could opportunistically do so. It would require tracking things that I'm not sure would be worth it. Like, we'd have to not only track whether like the property has changed in the interim, the way maybe someone said it. I don't know. Yeah. We'll look at it.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So, but it still sounds to me like if you would make the constructor parameters, you're basically telling the person, you tell us what mode it is in, right? Because you created the handle, you would know.
Well, but then there's two ways of interpreting that, Emo. It's which mode should it think it's in, or which mode should it go into? Because setting the property is enter this mode, change the underlying socket to be right. And if it's just tell me what mode you think it's in, then that is weird. And in that case, I'd say that the way that it's proposed is better.
Why is it weird? Because it basically controls behavior, right? It's not just for the diagnostic APIs. It's basically what mode are we interacting with the socket that you're giving us to.
And all the APIs will respect that, with the exception of the one that reports what mode it's in.
Yes, and I guess that maybe I still don't understand how this API works. Like it sounded to me like based on whether the blocking is on or off, you have different behavior of when you call it methods on our socket.
Yes. So generally, a developer will put the socket into a specific mode, and then all subsequent operations perform a certain way in response to that. So if I call read and the socket is in blocking mode, read will block until it can perform the read successfully. If I call read and it's in non-blocking mode, read and the read can't successfully return immediately, it'll return an error would block. The socket class will continue to correctly behave exactly in that way based on what the mode of the underlying socket. It's just that socket.blocking may not be accurate.
I see. So in that sense, it is purely a reporting issue, then not a behavior issue.
Right. It's in that
case,
it's reporting / behavior for the socket blocking API, but it's just reporting for the rest.
Right.
Yeah.
Then I think I am fine with the API as it is proposed.
And we'll just add lots of documentation to say, be careful of the following things.
I'm sure the 4 people who read it will really appreciate it. Yeah. All right. So
that was a fun full circle conversation. Thank you for the journey, Steve.
You're welcome. Thank you for humoring me.
Boom. Let me just post a comment as well, so just so we have everything documented. All right, so then I can close this guy here. Carlos, are you on?
I'm here.
Great. You want to talk to it?
Yeah. Do you want a minute to read the summary?
Either one works.
Okay. So I realized this is kind of similar to the previous API, we need to make an existing constructor public, one that receives a MemoryMappedFile handle, and we want to also pass an existing file stream IADisposable object. The reason why we need this constructor is because we are porting methods from framework, and in NetCore, these new methods are being added as extensions in a different assembly. So there's no way to access the private constructor that already exists. We don't want to make the internals visible because it would expose all internals. We also want to avoid making reflection calls. So the best way is to make the constructor public, but with this structure that we see here.
Can I ask a question on those premises for a second?
Mm-hmm.
What about refactoring to just move the types down so they're no longer in a different assembly?
Refactoring to move to a different assembly. You mean moving MemoryMappedFile to the assembly where we are adding the extensions?
No, I mean moving MemoryMappedFile ACL down to MemoryMappedFile.
We wanted the ACLs in a different assembly because they don't work on non-Windows systems.
That's fine. They don't have to be on the non-Windows system. I mean, the public APIs wouldn't work on those systems anyway, right? So they'd be throwing platform not supported as exception on those platforms.
Right. I feel like we were trying to keep the whole package as like only reference. You should only reference this if you hope that you're working on Windows.
No, but you would. We would do the whole like the same thing that we do with pipes, right? In pipes, don't we have the ACL types in the base assembly, and we have a separate assembly a separate ref assembly that just exposes the relevant APIs?
Okay, so just type forwarding in the implementation assemblies and making the refs lie. Okay, that's fair.
I guess I can try to see if it's possible. But yeah, I can look into this.
Cool, thanks.
So, Stephen, can you repeat what you?
I was asking. So it's. I mean, I interrupted Carlo rudely before he got to actually talk about the API, so I apologize for that. But you know, if this was just a public constructor that took MemoryMappedFile handle, like I'd have no concerns about that. But taking this other IADisposable thing, that is this other additional thing to dispose of when the MemoryMappedFile is disposed, is an implementation detail. So it's weird to me that we're adding a constructor for that. If it's the only way, okay, but I'm hoping we find another way. And the other way I'm suggesting is rather than have the reason this needs to exist is because the implementation that needs to use this is in another assembly. I'm suggesting move that implementation down to the same assembly and just expose it from the original one, the higher level one with type forwards.
I think that would make sense to me. I mean, I don't know enough about the details, but it seems like that's a pattern we have used elsewhere. The only thing with that is it's tricky machinery with the reference assemblies, right? But it's just the way things are in CoreFX, I guess.
So I think my suggestion is we continue reviewing this as a backup in case that doesn't work or we don't want to do that. But it'd be great if we could find something that didn't expose kind of our dirty laundry.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said. Like, to me, the handle one would be very unproblematic. That's like a very pattern we have in the BCL almost everywhere, where you can construct a managed object over the underlying native one. The file stream one seems more in the realm of plumbing, right, where it really doesn't make sense for anybody to call this. It's just there because infrastructure needs to call it.
Well, one thing with this is in Linux, our safe handle already has a reference to the file stream. We could just do the same thing on Windows so that you don't have to pass in this IADisposable.
Right. Smuggle the disposable thing via the safe handle.
Yeah.
If that works, I'm happier with that even.
Okay.
Oh, because we literally have a property then on the safe memory mapped file handle?
Not a property. At least on Linux, it's just set up so that when you call dispose on the file handle, it will dispose the file stream as well.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be a little careful with that to make sure that you didn't wash the handle through a pinvoke and lose the secondary properties on it. But as long as you're maintaining referential integrity, then that should work.
Okay.
Okay, so
I'll
then I
look
think
into these two suggestions.
But I don't know where we would be able to, like, yeah. So it would be interesting to see if there's a place that we can already hide it, because, like, how is the ACL assembly going to be able to set it? Because presumably unless we have a constructor that opens it from file stream, in which case that would be easy. We just save the reference. So.
And then I think, if those two all don't work out, I think my third would be, is safe memory mapped file handle sealed? If no, presumably the ACL APIs could just derive their own internal version of it and include the file stream on the handle. If not, I'd almost rather unseal safe memory map file handle so that could be done rather than add this API.
Steve wants something to be unsealed.
No, I don't want it to be, but I'd rather that than allow people to attach arbitrary IADisposables to memory map file.
Right. Because previously this was a file stream object, and we had objected that because it was only being used for dispose, we didn't like that there was a lot of ambiguity of what if you pass some unrelated file stream, what's that mean? And it just raised too many questions.
Right, so we're using the highest abstraction. Okay, so first suggestion is to try to bring those extension methods into the same assembly as MemoryMappedFile. Second suggestion is what Corey said, do what we're doing in Linux of having let me see if I understood that, having the file stream already pre-saved so we can dispose it. What did you say again, that it's being saved in Linux?
It's being saved inside the handle. It's not exposed in a property. It's only there so that when you call dispose on the handle, it will dispose the file stream as well.
Oh, okay, in the handle. And the third one is to unseal the class.
To do the second one.
Okay, the second one.
Like, so the third suggestion was to derive safe memory mapped file handle. If there's not a place that you can do the second one, then use a derived type so that you can.
Oh, okay.
And personally, my order for figuring out which ones of those would work or preference would be Corey's, so number 2, then the unsealing, so number 3, then the first, which is the combining assemblies, and then the last would be the one that's proposed, I think.
Okay, sorry, I think I got lost by what I was typing the notes. So option 1 that as I have it written right now is move the implementation from the higher level assembly to the assembly containing memory mapped file while maintaining the ref assembly split that we currently have. Then there was the option with the smuggling the data in the safe memory mapped file handle. I guess that is the option of having a field, and then there's the other option of deriving from it. Is that fair?
Yep.
Yeah.
So there's option 2A and option 2B kind of thing.
Yeah, and 2C is if safe memory mapped file handle is currently a sealed type, unseal it, and then do 2B.
And the order is field and then unsealing, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, at the end of the day, this is such a corner of the framework that if the proposed solution is the only one we can do, then okay. So I still think we should review it so that we don't have to kind of come back through this discussion.
I would call it parent. The file stream parameter, I would name it parent.
It also needs to be nullable.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with saying approved with feedback. I mean,
the other thing to look at would be, and I haven't investigated this whole issue and what's driving it, so I could be totally off base, but whether it would make more sense for the safe memory map file handle constructor to take the file stream rather than memory map file. But that ties in with it having a field and all that kind of stuff. So probably some investigation to be done on that part. And then if we can do it via a field and safe memory map file handle, there's a whole lot of options to explore about how best to expose that.
Okay.
Is that reasonable, Carlos?
Yeah.
Great.
all right. So then this one is done. Booyah, are you on the call as well?
Yep. We have several bugs related to this issue, and pretty much XmlReader and writer missing dispose async implementation, and so because of that, the async calls are calling sync dispose method, and that's causing issue for async only streams.
So XmlWriter need to write some final bytes when you close it. Is that correct?
Yep.
And yeah, anything that's still left in it that hasn't been flushed.
And XmlReader shouldn't need that? Would this just call dispose async?
XmlReader, I haven't really go through XmlReader, but we're having the similar bugs. So I think there is also need that. I'm just expecting.
I mean, if you had a custom stream, like if you had a stream that was, sending a fin style close across the network, then you would want it to call close async instead of close sync.
Yep.
So it's probably not reading more data, but it might be acknowledging that it's done reading data.
Right. My only comment, I think, is I know that none of our XML APIs pass in a cancellation token, but should we consider starting that here with close async at least?
We've generally hesitated to do that because these are used on, if you're using this in a using or something, right? And you cancel the operation, you don't actually want to cancel the cleanup / closing.
Yeah, dispose async, we would not have cancelable. I agree there. Oh God, Emo, you've done something bad. But close async, I think, would be the happy path that you could enable cancellation through.
And why?
You're tired of waiting on the ACK to the fin?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it also, if we expose a cancellation token there, then seems like it's going to push people towards just using that close async in place of dispose async. And then it's going to end up having the same problem as if dispose async took a token. No?
There's always a risk if someone decides that in their exceptional path they want to support cancellation still, that they would use it. I don't know if that's
but I'm not suggesting that maybe they're not deciding that. Like they just, oh, look, it takes a cancellation token. Let me pass one in. Right, in fact, we're talking about analyzers that are going to warn them that they're not.
Yeah, I guess this kind of just goes back to the problem of having both dispose and close, and what are the differences?
Right. What did we do on stream?
There is no close async.
Fair enough.
So what's funny is that I just looked at TextWriter. So TextWriter is IAsyncDisposable, TextReader is not.
Right. I was going to ask, why do we need the reader to be disposable here, or async disposable? Because there's no fin on the reader.
You don't know what the stream does?
Writing the data on read.
If you're using SIFs or Samba, it's going to send to the server, I'm done with this handle, release any exclusivity.
Yeah, but generally that would take place just in the background and return synchronously, because you don't need to wait for the app.
So an example with HTTP3, you don't have that nice, having all the things flush in the background feature. You actually do need to perform some I/O when you close out a stream if you want to make sure it's all acknowledged. So this could come in handy there.
So what would the implementation of this be? Check to see if the underlying stream is IAsyncDisposable. If so, call dispose async, otherwise fall back to dispose.
Well, all streams support IAsyncDisposable now. They just wrap dispose if not implemented.
Oh, I thought we just said they didn't. Okay.
Right, but if streams don't have a close async that takes a cancellation token, then there's nothing that this close async could do with a cancellation token.
Right. Well, if it's calling stream.flush async, it could pass the cancellation token to that.
So the writer
stream.flush async will fail on a read-only stream.
Yeah, so for XmlWriter, close async taking one could call flush async with a cancellation token. But on the reader, it couldn't, because, we could put it in the API, it just literally can't do anything with it.
So a related question, Steve, what happens if, say that the implementation of writer.closeAsync is it calls underlying stream.flushAsync and then underlying stream.dispose. If flush async throws an exception, is the dispose async method also supposed to throw an exception?
You mean because it might happen as part of the using?
Well, because if this is implemented as a flush and then a dispose, right. If the flush throws because maybe the underlying connection disappeared, right. Then does the overall dispose async transition to a faulted state or a finished state?
So it's implementation specific. Some of our streams do one thing, some of them do other things. Most of them aren't smart enough and will just try and flush again.
Dispose is allowed to throw exceptions. Finalizers are not.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
It's
discouraged, but pretty much every stream we have can throw from its dispose.
Okay.
With the exception of, I think, memory stream, and that might be it.
It can, whatever the CLR does whenever pointers jump in the wrong place. SEH exception?
Yeah, the unspeakable curses,
Right.
But yeah. I don't know. As for close, I think I understand where you're coming from, Corey, but I don't know. I'd encourage someone to use flush async with a cancellation token rather than close async with one.
Okay. Does XmlWriter have a flush async on it?
XmlWriter, yes.
Okay. In that case, can we just not have these close async APIs? Encourage people to use dispose?
Well, XmlWriter's an abstract class. Somebody has to write dispose somehow.
Well, no, I think Corey's suggesting dispose async be virtual.
Yeah, essentially the same model we've decided on for stream.
What does dispose do? Does it just call close?
Dispose async is supposed to be non-virtual.
Why do you say that?
Because you approved that guideline. We wrote it in the book. Because if you make it virtual, then somebody's going to forget to call suppress finalize this, which they're supposed to do as if regular dispose was called. So we wrote the basic dispose async pattern effectively, which is like the basic dispose pattern. Dispose is non-virtual.
But dispose is virtual on stream.
Yeah, we got it wrong.
We did?
Yeah, because we added dispose async before we came up with the guidelines for dispose async, and then we shipped it, and then we came up with the guidelines.
I feel like we got it wrong in the book, but maybe you and I should sync.
Anything that encourages people to propagate the dispose pattern, in my opinion, is just wrong. But whatever.
Yeah, I mean, like Emo and I drew this out on a board, trying to figure out if, for the degenerate case where you're dispose async and have a finalizer, which yes should not happen, but it's dispose async should be non-virtual, should call your dispose async core, then should call dispose false, and then should call should dispose async core, suppress finalize, dispose false, to make sure that you got anything that needed to run in the full absolute shutdown case.
Yeah,
That
I mean,
seems
I
way
remember
too
the discussion,
complicated.
and I think where we landed was right, but I don't remember the details. It might be worthwhile just thinking on this at some point and like seeing the flow chart again. But I mean, my other question is more basic actually. So the XmlReader writer, we have these create methods, these factory methods that we told everybody to use. And so you can construct a reader and a writer over a text reader and a text writer. So text writer is IAsyncDisposable, but text reader is not. So what does it now mean if you wrap an XML reader over a text reader that is not IAsyncDisposable? What does IAsyncDisposable do?
I think it means we wait until we have scenarios for XmlReader to be IAsyncDisposable before we do it.
Okay, so that one I would agree with. So then they basically only make the writer IAsyncDisposable, and then we do it in whatever mechanism we conclude is the right way of doing it.
Right. Because what we said, what we wrote in the book, is that it should be, assuming that close async is only here as the implementation of dispose async that is virtual, it should be public value task dispose async, protected virtual value task dispose async core.
Is XmlReader, does it have a public it has a public constructor?
Probably protected, but yes.
Or protected constructor? In other words, someone else besides
factory
the
method.
framework can derive from it?
Yes. I believe that is true. Let me double check.
Oh, versus internal only constructors. So while it's polymorphic, it's closed polymorphic.
Yeah.
Yes. The reader has a protected one, and I think the writer as well. Yes.
All right. All right. Well, we should do whatever the pattern is that we want to have. Jeremy, reconvince me offline that the pattern you've just espoused is the right one.
Okay.
Can you repeat slowly what you said earlier? So you would say dispose async is non-virtual.
Right.
And then we would have a protected dispose async core.
Yeah, hold on. I'm pulling up the book. It would be terrible if we wrote one thing and then did a completely different one. Yes, protected virtual value task dispose async core, which takes no parameters and is equivalent to dispose true.
And what does dispose async do?
Await dispose async core, dispose false, GC suppress finalize this.
Yeah, that sounds right.
It's kind of crazy.
I remember that now. But that's exactly why we have that pattern written down, because the chance of somebody getting that right doesn't seem very high.
Because the belief was if dispose async is equivalent to dispose, then it should remove it from the finalizer queue if it was registered for finalization. So we have to put that call somewhere. So we said continuing the pattern that we already have of the dispose itself is not virtual means that there's a definite place to put it.
So we don't need close async anymore? Instead that?
That becomes
the conclusion.
Well, close async becomes protected dispose async core.
Yeah, okay.
I guess. I mean, didn't we also say, like, if you want close async, what you really should do is flush async and then dispose?
Right, that's why it's protected now.
If you want a cancelable close async, you should call flush.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry, that was that.
Well, Jeremy, why didn't we like virtual dispose async that would just delegate to its base and the base would suppress finalize?
Symmetry?
Okay, well, it's not symmetric either way.
I know that this involved a lot of doodling things on a whiteboard back when humans were allowed to be near each other, and that all I did was in the end write down what was remaining on the board, and then my tech editor signed off on it. So
that idiot. For anyone listening, that was me. So
he was probably busy optimizing regexes, so it's fine.
I know. Priorities.
All right, so we don't want a cancelable, which is an impossible word to spell. Close async. That scenarios that should call. So flush already takes a cancellation token?
No, any of them not taking any cancellation.
I guess then
there's a separate discussion to be had of should all the other APIs be made cancelable. I think the close cancellation was more just preventing users from calling the wrong thing.
Yeah, what was the reasoning again to say the cancellation should be on flush async and not close async?
So you generally in any kind of structured exception handling solution, whether using or try finally, you're going to be closing this thing on the way out, and closing this is going to be cleaning up resources. You want to clean up resources even if you were canceled. You generally have one cancellation token, which is what triggered cancellation. If you also pass that into the thing that's supposed to clean up your resources and it prevents you from cleaning up your resources, it's not good.
That's fair.
Yeah. Because then the dispose async is going to throw canceled, and then the finalizer is going to run, which is what you were trying to avoid.
Well, that, and you're not going to, close your file or close your socket or whatever.
Yeah, I think that the usage pattern I would imagine is await using XmlWriter and then calling .close async with a cancellation token right before the scope closes so that your success case would get cancellation.
Yeah. If that was me, sure, you could do that. My concern is someone says, oh, well, why am I doing both the await and the close? I'll just do a try finally and have a close.
Yeah.
All right, so that leaves me with this. Let me copy and paste this in.
And scroll so we can see what you wrote.
Almost like you don't trust me.
Anyhow, by not having close async now, we at least leave the door open for the future if we decide that I'm wrong.
Wrong is such a strong word.
Misguided. Too quarantined.
Yeah, what's I about to say? There's a pun with quarantine in there somewhere.
Yeah. And here you explicitly left the dispose async off of XmlReader, it looks like.
Yeah, that's the first bullet.
Yeah, we should not make the reader
yes.
IAsyncDisposable.
See, the word reader wasn't highlighted like everything else, so I just skip over it.
Better. All right. So then, this is this one. Leomi,
Yes.
you're on.
Yes. Okay. So this issue is about allowing custom converters to handle null. Today, the serializer. So this is about JsonSerializer. So the serializer only passes null to custom converters if they are value types, structs. Okay, so I'm going to start off when we do not. So we don't pass null to custom converters for reference types. So instead, we return null on the serialization or for reference types, and on serialization, we write null directly. So this is primarily for performance. We always keep an extra call to the converter. And earlier on during the discussions for the converter feature, I mean, the resolution was that we didn't want people to have to check for null at the start of every read and write method override. Yeah, so we don't pass null to reference types, but for value types, we do pass null. That is to support internal logic for deserializing JSON elements and nullable of T. Where null is a value token. So for JSON element, we return a JSON element with the value kind null, and for nullable of T, and obviously those can be null. So we support those. And null is also a value for CLR types. So null is not a value; it's valid value for value types. So we hand over null to value types on deserialization to, well, not serialization because those can be null, but it's basically to say converter determine what to do with this invalid null token. So this feature provides a way for converters to opt into handling null regardless of whether they convert value or reference types. So this will have to be opt-in because of previous behavior that I just described. So users might want to handle null for various scenarios or situations, for validation or replacing a null token with something else, some default value. So I have a few, Stack Overflow, people brought this up. We didn't have a tracking issue. We're kind of tracking this internally, but I opened this issue like a few days ago to bring it for API review. So we have some partners who are requesting for this. So API proposal here, JSON converter. So before I move on, any sort of question about the premise or?
Can you just share an example where you would want to handle null?
Okay, so I have so the usage example I have here is you have like a profile URI, so just some random example where the JSON comes back as null for whatever reason in the payload, but you don't want to store null in your app context at runtime because you want the value to be there so you can.
Sorry, Leomi. Emo, could you scroll down so we can see what he's talking about?
Oh, sorry. I'm scrolling on my screen happily.
Oh, nice. So go ahead, Leomi. Sorry.
Yeah. So imagine like a user profile account for some app. You have a first name, last name, and a link to their profile page. So JSON comes back, and then for some reason it doesn't have a null. I mean, it doesn't have a value. So you want to replace that null token with some value on deserialization. So the read method there. And for writing, for some reason, if you have null, you want to write out some default value. So today you can't do this because the serializer will not pass you the null token. And a bunch of people have various scenarios where they want to do this. So we already have existing logic to pass null to converters for deserialization, because as I mentioned above, like JSON element is a struct, and we need to deserialize that and pass it null. Well, let it know that null is trying to be deserialized, and also for nullable types as well. So this infrastructure exists internally.
Right, and this is only going to invoke it when you see the null token. It's not going to fire an artificial null token when the property was missing.
No, yeah,
so
it's when
they
we
can
see,
still get null profile URIs if they didn't transmit it.
That's right. And this also applies for serialization as well, because the CLR type can be null. So you want to do something else when serializing. So that's an example of when someone wants to use it. So we've gone over like API usage. So I'm not sure if everybody saw the API proposal, because that's what we're going to. So Imo, if you can just scroll up to go over that. Okay, so JSON converter of T exists today right now. So we're proposing a virtual boolean. Get only, because you just have to return true or false whether you want to handle null. So default value for value types will be true, because that's the behavior today. So you can't change that, because that will be breaking, and because I think it makes sense. But for reference types, the value will be false, because that's the behavior today. So of course any converter can say true or false. So the behavior. So if you're a value type and then you opt out of handling null, then we will likely return a default value when we see null and you've decided not to handle it. Then of course, if you're a reference type and you opt in, then you have null and can do whatever you want with it. And I think that's about, yeah.
Sorry, I was going to ask, on that note, did you consider an alternate design where there is a, like, this is a method that takes the T and returns a T, or that gives back the T that should be used for null?
So there's a related feature where we say, like, either null came in, then I want to replace null with this value, or there was no JSON and I want to put this value instead. So that's related to like default value handling. That's something else which people have asked for, and it could solve this scenario. But specifically, people want to be able to handle null in their converter. So, well, that is something which we could support and maybe should. I don't think it directly solves this problem. I mean, it solves it dependent on, if you're just trying to replace null with something else. But if you just want null to be in your converter and that's what you're asking for, then that doesn't satisfy the requirement.
Sorry, I'm not entirely understanding. Can you give me an example? To be clear, I'm not suggesting we do that instead. I'm just trying to understand the trade-offs. What if I had use, a method that's called and it hands back the T for null? What wouldn't that handle that this proposal does?
Well, I guess
it handle your example, right? Because your example was replace null with http mycompany.com or something, right?
Well, it does. It does satisfy the scenario. I guess I'm saying that's not what people are asking for. But I guess I think this proposal satisfies what people are asking for and what they're used to coming from Newsoft. Well, Newsoft also does provide multiple ways to do it, including something like what you've described. But if we decide to say, hey, that's the approach we want to take instead, I think it's valid as long as they can get to do what they want to do.
I don't know the trade-offs. I'm just trying to understand what options were considered.
The option with like getting a T for the value, like you have to have another way thing to, right? Like where you given a null, you have to construct a T out of it. So there's a very common pattern where users want to see string.empty instead of a null value. So it just adds more APIs as opposed to like this one where you get one API for both serialization and deserialization.
Right, but again, it requires that what was explicitly sent on the wire was the token null. It doesn't handle, like, if it was transmitted using the current version of the serializer with ignored null or whatever the name of the property is, then the null string would not have been written on the wire. The property is just not set, and then you're still going to get null back because this doesn't fire on properties that were not present. So I'm not sure this is like, people may say this is what they want. I'm not sure it is what they want. Is a little bit of a question. And then how does this when serializing, does handle null returning true beat the serializer being in ignore null mode?
So if we told us to ignore, so if options ignore null value, we will not fire here because we see that the value you're trying to serialize is null, and then this doesn't trump that. And I don't think it should.
I mean, like, it just, now there are two conflicting things saying what to do for null, and just making sure we know what it's supposed to do, and we've decided what it's supposed to do, and we write that down and we test it.
Because this is to mean if. So I mean, my definition for this would be if we're not ignoring null, I can handle null. It's how I describe this behavior.
If you're round tripping, so say that you have a client and server and you're round tripping some kind of structure, and if the structure has an empty string property because that's what you expected in the first place, when would you ever get null on the wire in that scenario? Like, your server will never send null to the client in that scenario that I just described. So this property theoretically will never even get called in such a scenario.
I mean, yeah, in that scenario, perhaps, but the various, I mean, going into all the scenarios that could possibly happen, like JSON could come out of nowhere. It might not necessarily be in a round trip scenario, the way we typically think about when we design these features. Somebody might just happen to have null, and then they want to be able to determine what to do with it when they see it in their payload.
Right, and I get that. I recognize that there's a scenario where you're reading from some third party. The third party has put null on the wire. You're consuming it, but in that case, we would say that the JSON converter's handle null property is telling you, how do you want me to deserialize null? What I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around is, if we say this property is also controlling serialization, at that point, generally, is the scenario not round tripping? Because if you're serializing, presumably you're also deserializing.
Right, so if you've serialized and you've handled null, then that means typically when you're deserializing, you're not going to handle, you won't need to handle null because that would never be null. Is that what you're, is that the
right?
point?
And that's what I'm trying to figure out, is whether we actually need two different properties for that, because I don't necessarily see how the two will ever be both be relevant at the same time.
Okay, so if we
maybe I'm overthinking this, but
all right, I'm just thinking if we split it up, like whether, so you have handle write null or read null, whether there will ever be a case where one is used and the other is not used.
I mean, ultimately, that's all this thing does is call the existing read and write methods on for serialization, deserialization. So you can do whatever you want in that. You can not do anything, or you can add some logic. So I don't think we need two rules here, because you still have control over that.
Does this property need to be on the JSON converter base class rather than the JSON converter of T derived class? Because right now CanConvert type is on the base class.
So the reason I put it, so yeah, okay, so that's a good point, that some other method that determines whether the converter is called is on the base type. But for me, like, read and write are on this type, and the only time you would want to ask whether you want to handle null is when you're about to read or write. So I thought to put it here.
Okay.
Yeah. But I don't know, I mean, whether that's sort of breaking the parity with some other
Well, no, if you're saying that this is a sibling API to read and write, then it makes sense, right?
Yeah, that was my thinking.
Sure.
Yeah.
So maybe I missed this, but like we said earlier that we will not call this API when. Oh, sorry. We said earlier if the property is entirely missing in the payload, we won't call the converter at all, right? We only call it when there's an actual value in the payload. If we were to call the converter, even if the property, if the property is missing, wouldn't that address effectively all scenarios?
So if we call the converter even when the property is missing in the JSON?
Yes. Because then it's implicitly not effectively, right?
Well, doesn't that break patch scenarios?
What do you mean?
You have an existing object and you're deserializing a diff into the object.
Oh, perhaps. But I think we need another related feature to say, my thing was missing. I want to. What do you do when no JSON came from this payload, which NewtonSoft has? I think they have a. So they have default value handling, which says populate with this value if there's nothing in the JSON. So I don't think that would. I mean, I don't. So if we implement similar sort of feature, I don't think that will override the behavior that we have here, or influence it in any negative way.
Okay.
Well, that's the thing that we should probably validate. I mean, like to me, it seems I agree with you that it probably is two different features, and you may want one but not the other. But we should make sure that the design is not, the design will work for both of them, and it looks like they were both designed and not like accidentally stitched together, right? Sorry, stitched together. You know what I mean? Like, so like, for example, if, another way of doing it is to, I don't know, like to have a different bool here, or maybe just have a different kind of mechanism on how this stuff is being registered. It should just feel consistent between the two scenarios, I guess, is what I'm saying.
So, yeah, so I mean, the only interaction is if the feature says if this thing is null, then replace it with this value. Then that would, so the only interaction is that would then mean that we wouldn't call the converter or this method. If the feature goes, if my JSON is missing, or if null is the value for my for this token, then we wouldn't even check the value, this handle null. We'll just be replacing it with a default value. But yeah, that's slated
right.
for, yeah, but and I don't.
But that seems to kind of suggest that we wouldn't expose the Boolean here, right? That seems to suggest we just have two options on the JSON settings, and it would say, default value for missing property is one setting, and then default value for null property is a different setting, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think looking at the Stack Overflow issues linked, I think those users would probably be very confused by trying to use this and unspecified properties showing up as null instead of empty string.
Right.
Yeah, that's my biggest concern for confusion, is that especially given the ignore nulls serializing option, that it was null and you thought you registered a thing to handle that on deserialize, but it's not firing, and it's because what you wanted was a default value. And the two are going to have an interesting intermix, I agree. And I think that's the biggest concern we're having, is if you haven't actually finished designing what you want to do for default values, that this may be premature.
Okay, yep, I will. Yeah, that makes sense. I will. So yeah, I don't think that. Yeah. Okay. So I'll come back to this when we design something for default for replacing nulls or empty strings. I don't think Newtonsoft does it for nulls. But yeah, I'll confirm and circle back here.
And just as an overview of kind of our recap of what happened in the past is that, as mentioned on the very top, we don't call the read and write for nulls. I mean, we could have elected to call it. That would have a slight perf hit, a bigger perf hit back in the original implementation. And then also we thought people would forget to put the first line of code at the top of every read and write method. But assuming we didn't make that decision, what we would have done is, you just have to handle token type of null on deserialize and then check for null on serialize if you want different behavior. So, I mean, this is just saying, hey, ignore our special logic we have and call the normal method you would expect, which is read and write. So I don't think it overlaps with defaulting. I mean, I think that's completely separate, missing values. Because you could have their default values implemented not within the converter. I mean, just our attributes, etc. But anyway, I mean, I'm fine with the guidance to say go and think about defaulting, but I don't think they overlap.
I think if this is going to be looked at as a completely separate thing, then we should have some concrete examples in the issue of what this will solve.
That also seem like they wouldn't be confusing for users if the property was completely missing as opposed to the property was specified as the literal null.
Yeah, the current scenarios, it seems like this proposal would not be intended to solve any of those.
Yeah, this has nothing to do with default values.
Right, but it has a little bit to do with user confusion once you turn this on. Because if the places that people are asking about it, it feels like what they're asking about is default values, then they think that the two intermix.
And just for clarity here, that this only is set to true by the actual implementation of a converter, not from the consumer.
Right.
So the only person that would be confused is the guy who owns the converter, and
or the user who wrote one to solve their problem and then their problem didn't get solved.
Yeah. I mean, with a little testing, it'd figure it out, so they'd be confused for a little bit. But
like, I think that from the feature as proposed, that the shape looks reasonable for what's described. But as the bigger scenario problem, I think it's potentially missing the scenario and potentially is going to interact poorly with the bigger scenario. And so my specific concern is make sure that we understand the big picture before we talk about the tiny detail.
Okay, but then my question is, how then do you allow people to handle null in their converters? Is that not something that should be?
I think that instead of like that, because you've mentioned default and you said default or null. And if default takes default or null, now you have to understand how all this is going to interact. Ignore null, handle null, default or null. Like you now have 3 different interpretations of what null means, and can you write a consistent user story?
There's only one interpretation of null in this scenario.
Well,
null is just the JSON token type null when you read it, and the value when you serialize it.
So what would we expect? A converter
so
to
maybe
give
there was,
if it read null. What is a valid value that it would give for null?
Whatever I want to give. I don't. You mean on deserialization?
Yeah, like how.
That's the point of a converter.
Say we did implement this. What example, like what scenario would you want converter to do this? Like, is there a sentinel null value for something where an actual null is not appropriate, or like, is there a scenario that this tackles because the 3 listed are not that?
Yeah. So I can. So there's, again, as I mentioned, the partners that request this and have to write custom converters to handle an entire wrapping type, because they can't handle null they can't specify what to replace the null value with. So I think when it comes to converters, in general, users should have leeway to do what they want. And by not providing a way to handle null, then the converter is not complete in a sense, because the converter should give users the way to completely take control of deserialization and serialization.
I mean, the canonical example, I think, is a string. So if you see a null on your property during serialization, you want to write empty string out. If you see a null coming in, maybe because it's not your value, it's from some other third party, then you want to set your property to empty string instead of null.
Right, I can see it in the limited scope that this is presenting it as, but that it feels like the people who are using it don't understand it in the scope it's presented. And if the default proposal comes along and it is not going to intermix the notion of I'm reading null and that means I should do the default instead of null, then that's fine. And you've drawn a clear separation and the two things don't interact. But when you say things like default or null as a phrase, then that muddies the situation. And now it's less clear what things are supposed to do, and it's less clear that we have a coherent story for a scenario.
Where do you see the default or null terminology?
Naomi said it.
Okay, so yeah, this doesn't have anything to do. I mean, replace null with some default value is what I might have said, to say you have null and then now you don't want to replace it with something else, or just handle null generally, regardless of whether you consider it to be a default value.
Right, but when the default values proposal gets looked at and designed and whatever, if anybody during the time that you're looking at that says, oh, and maybe we should say that the default value should be returned if we see the null token coming in, now you have two conflicting interpretations.
I think it's reasonable to say in that case that the default value handling would apply if there's no JSON for when you're deserializing. And I think that is how it applies in Newtonsoft as well.
Right, and that if it says null, it means null unless the converter changes it. And I think that that's a reasonable interpretation. You just need to have decided that for defaults before we can really say that this makes sense for converters.
I've been hesitant to prematurely say that during this API review, but I think that's the direction in which it will go. That if we do the default value handling, where that would only apply if JSON is missing, and then we'll leave the null since we already have a solution for that. Generally, so this, I think we definitely will have to do this. And one thing is I generally don't want to have too many ways to do the same thing within the library, which I think is a problem with Newtonsoft JSON. So if we go down these semantics for the handling null, then replacing a missing JSON with a default value wouldn't interact here, because we're limited to only if there's no JSON coming in. So in that light, I think unless there's any serious objection, otherwise I think it's reasonable to move forward with this.
I would like to see an actual scenario that this solves, that a user is asking for. I haven't seen that today.
I don't know.
First, I haven't clicked on all of these, but I'm assuming there's say I want to serialize empty strings instead of null strings, just from the link. It solves that.
but it only partially solves it, because as a user, I would assume that a property not existing is identical to it being null. Maybe that's an incorrect assumption, but it's what I would have made and have made using various REST APIs. So I don't know if this is the right place to handle that.
Yeah, I think people might want to handle null differently than default values. So I'm okay with saying, hey, we should look at default handling in conjunction with this. I don't even know, however, if default handling is on the radar for 5.0. Naomi, is it?
It's backlog. And this is important for. I'm just trying to look up, for Corey's scenario. There's actual in the Cosmos database. Codebase. There's a scenario where they replace a null with some default value for their class.
Yeah. So for default handling today, you have to set your field or your property in the constructor. So you can kind of do it today. It's clunky. There's no callbacks or anything like that. So we definitely have a gap with the default value handling. We purposely scoped that out for view 1. But if we don't do it, we will need something like this, I think, for 5.0.
Yeah, this is backlog for 5.0. It's not one of the priorities. Default value handling,
Yeah. I have a related question. We had talked about whether there should be a difference between null literally being on the wire versus a property not existing on the wire. Do we have evidence about how commonly that difference occurs in practice? Like, do we have evidence that that services actually write out literal nulls rather than just eliding the property entirely?
We have evidence that it exists, but I'm not sure what the statistics are on how common one is versus the other. What context?
I think a lot of both.
Right, and it also depends on the scenario, right? If you return data from the server, then eliding probably makes sense. If you send data for updates, then you might not elide them because you want to explicitly null them out rather than not modifying them, as you suggested earlier, right?
Right. Well, this gets to what was being mentioned earlier about, maybe we really do need a strong difference between this versus something didn't exist at all. I know that's something I think, Steve, you were pushing it just a few minutes ago. So is that, and it sounds like that's something you want to keep as a separate proposal rather than rolling into this. It does seem very much related.
If we draw the line between there was nothing missing in JSON, this property wasn't present in JSON and something was present, which is null, then they're not related. Because the converter is saying I'm deserializing something which exists, whether in the JSON or from the CLR type that you're serializing. So the converter can't interact with anything where there's no JSON. So I think it's able to draw that line again, just so we don't have multiple ways to do the same thing, where to say, okay, we have null, and then now you want to replace it with something. We start to go down that path if we have not default value handling, interact with the converters and interact with this handle null feature.
Yeah, the one thing that we have said in the past is that we see the converters as the ultimate patch, right? And originally we also had this idea of callbacks, right, where you're on deserialization, where you basically get the instance after deserialization, you can mess with it afterwards, right? But we haven't done that because we said the converter will handle all these cases, right? But it seems like we discover more and more cases where the converter either is insufficient or doesn't have enough information to make a decision, right? Which seems we should probably think about that. Another option would be we add another virtual method to JSON converter, I don't know, on missing value or something, right? But I'm wondering how far we can do this before we realize that we really need a generic on deserialize method or something that allows you to inspect the object after deserialization and do some additional stuff with it, right?
Please, 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 no.
On deserialize.
That's where all the security bugs come from.
That's fair, but then the question is, what's the alternative to that design, right?
The converter can handle whenever something's missing because but it needs to pop up a level. It needs to look at the bigger type, not at the individual property value. It's just a difference.
The converter can handle it, but
yeah.
So the converter, it's that's what the serializer has to. The serializer is the party deciding that, right? But then it can forward the information to the converter and say oh, the property that you're the type of was missing in the payload. Now give me whatever value you want to give me, right?
Right, because the string scenario on this one, assuming that I understand how the API works, which may be wrong, if you wanted to normalize the null value for strings to the empty string, you would register a JSON converter of string. But if you only wanted the null value for a string to be the empty string on profile, you would register something for profile, handle all the properties individually for profile, and then say, oh, you never gave me a profile URL, or you gave me a null profile URL. I'm handling that specifically. This is now the default value. But that's already, you're in class specific logic. It's not getting called back for arbitrary nulls. It's handling an entire complex payload.
Yeah, I think these are the two options you have, right? I mean, that makes sense to me. That's why I'm saying it like if you do it in the converter, you would handle it for every single property that is of that type, right? Which might be useful, right? Because you may not want to do that for every single object in your payload, rather you just want to handle the type once and for all, right?
Maybe, but registering a JSON converter of string that turns all null strings into the empty string seems heavy-handed.
Yeah, I mean, maybe for primitive types it is, but like for your own custom types, it doesn't seem like it, right? Because if you have your own schema, I mean, that's the rules in your schema, right? They will probably apply to all instances of that type.
Fair enough. But again, that's the Corey's question of what's the scenario, because if it's turned the empty string or the null string into the empty string, I don't think we really want people registering JSON converter of string. That
I agree.
Instead, they would be registering a converter for their custom type that says that when it's this property on this type, do something different, which is sort of kind of the same as the on deserialized callback, except with less. You didn't pay attention to what properties actually got set security bugs.
As far as setting the particular property, I mean that's what this one is
for the
property
URI profile.
Right. So it's not global.
Fair enough.
And today you can do all of this just without the null, right? So just because we added this quirk, almost you can call it, in view 1 is the only reason why we're having this discussion. Otherwise, on deserialize, you can have a string property mapped to an int, JSON, and you just check, hey, is it token type int? Okay, well, call int.toString and set the string or return the string. So having another token type of null, is completely normal, I think, coming in for deserialize, and then going out, it's the same thing. Normally, you get every single value of your object. However, we thought the serializer would just remove, the possibility of bugs, and then the perfect thing. So this is a case basically where we limit the capability of the converter because it's not called. I think it's the only case.
Fair enough. I mean, if you have like a 90% confidence that default values, if it's ever added, isn't going to interact poorly with this, then I can think that that's fine. Just it feels like from a scenario level, they're really, really, to a user, they're almost indistinguishable.
Yeah, how about this? I mean, I agree with you on that one, and I don't want to block the feature for much longer, but it seems like at least I would like to see us being confident about that. And it seems, based on the discussion, that we don't really seem to know how we would handle that case, right?
Can we look at the default values API and then decide where to go on this once we have that one?
I think that's
to me, it's like
to
me, it's
really
like
5.0
feature. Yeah, I don't necessarily ask for like a full design, right? Like it's just like, if somebody can describe to me how this would work roughly, and then say, this is why I believe it doesn't interfere with this feature, this explosion, this bool is totally fine. I'm totally fine with that. I just want to make sure that we have that level of confidence, and this discussion doesn't necessarily inspire that confidence. It seems like there's still a lot of discussion on how this could work. And there's a difference between a full design on a feature and just, as Jeremy said, just having that confidence that we're not shipping a feature that we immediately after post 5.0 we add another feature, and now we have two features that interact very badly with each other. That seems very unfortunate.
And if Laomi, Steve, if you guys are willing to say, because we've shipped this feature, we know that we can't make default and null interact, then sure. But we need a confidence statement.
That's the direction I would personally be going with. To say that default handling feature would be for if JSON is missing, and not for if JSON is null. Because converters should be able to handle null, in my opinion. Should be able to do anything with whatever JSON is there. So if we decide that that's the way that null can be replaced, then I would say that I wouldn't propose default value handling that will handle the case where the JSON is null.
So if I'm a user and a property is not specified, or it could be null, in order to get a string.empty replacement behavior on both of those, I would need to use two separate APIs.
Or just register a full converter for your type.
Because it feels like the overwhelmingly common case would be null and unspecified are identical from the user perspective. It seems like a much more rare thing that null would mean something special and unspecified would mean something different.
So yeah, it would just, yeah, it would mean, okay, I'll bring this back next week. Because I would just say, like, no, I'll just say, if you were talking about null and missing, I think that would be a case of one feature trumping over the other one. So it's a stretch to say you have to like use a converter for this case, and because the priority, well, you know, I don't think it's too bad to say if you want to handle, you know, if you think it's null, then, you know, use the converter as you've been doing today, and because that feature already exists, so most people already have logic in their converters to handle this if they have to do it. And then for default value handling, you know, put the default value attribute to specify what, you know, value you want to replace things with. And then if the JSON is missing, then we'll use that value instead. So in that way, I think they're separate. But I don't think it has to be ceremonious where it's a big problem where you have to do both things. And maybe, you know, people will generally use the converter to handle all cases. But
I mean, maybe a converter can return a status of, like, maybe it doesn't have to be Boolean. Maybe it can be use default or null or something like that. Like, communicate that the default value should be used if it sees null in some cases, and in other cases it can return some special value.
Yeah. So mark it as deeds work. Like if you feel like you have a high confidence claim during the week and it's just a minor modification of what you have, you can also do it over email. You don't have to wait for a full week if you need to make forward progress. But, you know, given that we only have 15 minutes left, we should look at the next issue that you have, the support for non-public accessors and fields.
Yep. Okay.
Then we can at least make, hopefully this is easy. Hopefully we can just approve it. Or not, depending on how we go with that.
Okay, so there are two issues. So these, so field support is one separate issue, and non-public accessor support is another issue. So I wrote up this proposal to address both of them, since, like, I'm proposing similar API to handle those scenarios. So starting with non-public accessors for serialization and deserialization. So this is not talking about non-public properties. So this is talking about public properties which have, you know, the primary, you know, the predominant cases, it has a public getter and a non-public setter. So right now we do not use the non-public setter for deserialization, but it can be serialized, and, you know, people want a way to, it's part of the public contract, so people want a way to deserialize it. And then, although non-public getter usage is not common and also not really requested, I include support for this because Newtonsoft has parity and it's cheap to implement and test. And I don't think we need to further complicate the API to support this in the future. I think by just, you know, opting in the way I would describe, you should be able to handle both non-public getter and non-public setter. So that's non-public accessors. So field support, there's no way to serialize and deserialize fields using the serializer. We scoped out of 3.1. So just a note that according to guidelines, they're generally not recommended, but .NET itself uses these types. Uses fields, like for instance, value tuples. So this feature will support value tuples.
So assuming we went ahead with this, how are we thinking about responding to a customer when in the next release they say, hey, I was serializing system.foo and you changed its internal structure and now my code is broken?
So the foo was serializing empty, like a value. Like I guess we can. It's a breaking change, which.
Well, it looks, Steve, like you have to slap an attribute on the field that you want serialized, so it's not reaching in to CLR types. People have to paint it themselves. Okay,
I see. So I only see what's currently on the screen, which doesn't include.
No, there is a global option that would enable it.
Yeah, there's a global option. So things like value tuples are not, we serialize them empty now, which for many people is a problem, and I think doesn't make sense. And I think it'd be reasonable to make a breaking change to actually serialize those contents.
I honestly would say my line in the sand is, if you want to serialize fields for whatever reason, or private fields for whatever reason, you have to mark the type. Like I think we don't want to be in a world where people can globally turn it on for any random type, because to Stephen's point, it's not a breaking change if we change internals of a type. That's a completely compatible change, right? It's just that we go out of our way to provide a feature that can turn private implementation changes to breaking changes, which I think is what we don't want.
But this will not happen in this case because we're not going to be. This doesn't support private fields. It's just going to be public fields, and then for built-in types like value tuples, which people want, including partners. It seems.
Oh, sorry. So the global option is only for public fields.
Only for public fields.
If you need non-public access, then you have to use the JSON object attribute.
Well, actually, so this won't support this. So that will not support non-public fields. It will only be for public fields. So someone can reserve the right to say, "Hey, you are not serializing my fields before. Don't serialize them now." Is what this would provide. But this doesn't provide support for non-public fields.
Yeah, I think, Steve, to your question, the line in the sand is if you require the payload to be consistent across versions of the framework, don't serialize types that are not under your complete control.
Okay.
That's true.
We reserve the ability to add APIs, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
surely, but I buy that argument. The problem is just that if we combine this with a feature where you accidentally or intentionally serialize private state, then that doesn't work, right? Because people always use framework types in their public types.
Yeah, but
usually it's like strings or list of T or something, right?
But yeah.
Yeah. But that's I think why we need to be careful that we don't design a feature where people either intentionally or unintentionally can serialize private state of framework types.
Right, but that larger concern. Sorry, go ahead, Corey.
I think I can buy the usage pattern of just forcing people to mark the fields that they would want, including private fields, perhaps, and not having a global option to do that.
So how then do we support built-in types like value tuple?
Explicitly.
I think we would have a converter for that.
Converter, I see.
Yeah, because we want to support that.
I see.
Right. So I guess public fields I can understand, right? Public fields is public things can work. But for the non-public accessors, wouldn't AOT just can't do this?
Right. That's something we'll have to communicate, because if you look at, this overwhelmingly people wanted, and I think we just have to document. It's not super clear what the implication will be just yet, because we don't know if we're going to be if we do generate serializers, we might generate them on the type themselves depending on the design, so that might not be a problem. Well, otherwise that would be a problem. So I think that would be a case where we communicate that certain like non-public usage can force you, can either, depending on how we design it, can either just not be supported, and or we let you know that we will go down a fallback path using existing paths that would use the reflection.
I mean, what you could say right now is if you want like some kind of ahead of time like code gen serializer thing, you support POCOs and that's it. Like POCOs have to have get set properties, have to have public fields, like they're done.
Yeah, I'm just like, if it's a thing that has to be put explicitly on the object, then you'll get warnings at that level. But because I guess I only see include fields suggested as a JSON serializer option, but so maybe I'm just conflating state.
What about read-only fields?
I assume it's treated like a read-only property.
So that's the read-only keyword.
So they get serialized, but you can't deserialize them, just like with read-only properties.
Right. Actually, can we deserialize them with reflection?
Not necessarily, because depending on what runtime you're on, the runtime might actually throw an exception. Just
like other reflection features that we use now, or in a different way?
There's the runtime has gotten a lot stricter lately about being able to write to things that are marked as read-only. For instance, if you try using reflection to overwrite the property of a static read-only field, we may have already code-genned the value of that and burned the value into various call sites. At that point, reflection will actually throw an exception saying, like, I've already code-genned this, sorry, I can't do anything for you. You can imagine in the future that being extended to instance properties or instance fields as well, not just static fields.
Yeah, I think they would have to use your other feature of constructor matching.
It's definitely something we'd have to test for, especially if we do the IL emit option for setting fields.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so the same as read-only properties.
So is the JSON object attribute that is on the screen right now, is that a completely new attribute?
Yes, this is newly proposed.
So what does JSON object mean?
There's two options here also. The other one does not have this attribute. So if that's offensive, then maybe option 2 would be better.
Well, I was trying to understand, are we adding like the difference between adding a new attribute that has properties on it or adding properties to an existing attribute?
Right.
Right. So,
I mean, it's also, we already have a JSON property name attribute. It seems a bit odd to have JSON property as a concept and then have a thing called JSON member. Like,
yeah, I mean, I would refer to JSON property name as the thing, like representing what the CLR type would be written as JSON, or what to look for when we're deserializing. Versus JSON member means this is a member on a POCO that we should include during serialization or deserialization.
Yeah, I get what it means, but it seems the terminology that we choose is property, right?
We could have said JSON object serializable or something like that. I mean, but it only is applied to classes and structs, not members.
I think it means for the JSON member.
Yeah, it seems to me like we could merge them, right? I mean, for example, like it seems odd to me to apply the attribute to the whole type. It seems much more in line with saying you need to apply them to the individual members you want to be serialized. And then you can have just JSON property attribute, and then, for example, have additional settings on that one to say, what do you want to do with non-public accessors, right? If you apply to a field, it doesn't apply, but if you apply to property, then it clearly applies, right?
So one benefit to applying it to the type rather than to the individual members is if you have a code, if you have a source generated partial class, you can apply the attribute to a dummy partial declaration that's similar to how data annotations used to work way back in full framework. You can't necessarily easily do that at the property or member level.
Right, because you can only declare void private methods as partial.
Yeah.
I mean, the question is like, it's like, is that a scenario though? Because I mean, it seems to me when you want to include, like, basically what this indicates is how fields or non-public things are being treated on that type, but that still seems like it should probably be a local decision, not a global decision.
I mean, so are you saying this, acknowledging that there's another member, there's another attribute being proposed that actually does provide that local opt-in?
Yeah,
that we should only use that one versus including both attributes.
Yeah, I think I would. I mean, in general, I would encourage us to avoid too many switches that are overlapping, because that eventually results in complicated state to reason about, like what takes precedence and what doesn't. But it generally seems to me that if we believe that fields are somewhat rare, and if we generally believe that non-public accessors are kind of rare, then I think it makes more sense to me that you apply, and similar to renames, right? We said renaming happens at the member level. You put the attribute on the member you want to rename, and because this is a somewhat rare scenario. And then for the global things that are common, like Pascal case, we have a global setting, right? So I can buy the global, please include public fields, because as Jeremy said, public fields seems only fine. But then anything that involves non-public state should be an opt-in per member, in my opinion, because it seems to be somewhat rare, and yeah, that's where you have to express your intentions. Because otherwise, if we apply this today you happen to have two private things that you want to do, and then tomorrow you add a third one. Did you really meant to expose it? Maybe, yeah. But maybe not. I mean,
and the JSON object attribute type right now there are two things, and you're like, fine, if you specified it, you probably wanted them both to be included, so they're ignore to change the default, but anything future would have to have the opposite state for a default, because it would be behavior preserving. So it would need to be written the other way anyway. But yeah, I think that we should get rid of the type level one and just the member level one.
And we would have a global include fields on the serializer as is proposed here.
Which only means public fields.
We should probably call this public, because it can't be protected, right? It needs to be truly public.
I don't necessarily know if we need to include that technically, because if you have include fields and you put JSON member on a private field, like, it'll get serialized, right? Like the two of them combined allow private fields to go out.
I would say even if the global one is off, if you put JSON member on a field, it should be included no matter what the global setting is, right? Because it's a
great.
Okay. Yes. Fair enough.
Yeah, but I mean, right now, nobody's asking for private fields, and I don't know. It's up to just some security perspective whether we should include support for that.
I mean, if somebody puts an attribute on something, that is the maximum amount of opting in that you can do. Like, I don't care what happens as long as somebody is explicit.
Yeah. What about, so same thing will apply to non-public properties?
Right. So that's yeah. So, but all of these, you then have to ask the question of, as we start trying to be more inclusive of AOT environments, like, what of this is going to start randomly failing when you start doing a target specific AOT single file distribution? Like, does the entire serializer stack fall on the floor? Like, we're adding a lot of things in the same release, and it seems like this isn't interacting well with other things we want to add.
But that's something an analyzer could help with, though.
Yeah, either that, or the way I understood Naomi's comment was that one way to do serialization is that we generate the code-written serializer as part of a member of the types themselves, in which case they can clearly see their own privates, right? It would just mean that if you can't do that, then what happens if you take, without source generator, you take a random assembly and try to use it on iOS, right? It just means you fall back to reflection.
Fair enough.
But I think
can just throw no support. can just throw not supported for that type.
Yeah, that's the thing we should avoid though, because these are kind of the landmines people really dislike, right? Because it's hard to reason about behavior changes that are like cross-cutting, like AOT on versus AOT off. Right, it kind of makes sense for things where you generate code, right? I think people can understand that reflection emit doesn't work on an iPhone, right? But it's very hard to reason about all the features that happen to use reflection emit on its implementation level, right?
Right. I mean, like the notion of, so if you have to put the properties on every individual member, and then yeah, you had to control the type to do it. Generating it inside the same type works, and there's no weird external state that's going to rewrite what all that's doing. And so that makes more sense than some bigger level options.
Doesn't the JsonSerializer right now allow you to specify, like as a sidecar option, oh, this property didn't actually have this attribute on it, but pretend it did, as far as the serializer options are concerned? Doesn't that ability exist?
No, we discussed it initially. That was the initial design, but I think we abandoned that in favor of the converters, right?
But I thought you could associate a converter with a specific property, even if you didn't control the actual type that the property was declared.
No, you can't. We did discuss an option where you could add quote unquote attributes at runtime. We talked about that for a long time, but eventually we decided not to do that. But
okay. Because if we did that, this would obviously play with that system.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So no JSON object attribute. Okay.
Yeah. Let me just summarize what we have, and then we can look at this in the window. Because I think it will be hard otherwise. Too much API surface to reason about. So what I heard is nobody has an objection with the global setting, right? So long it only applies to publics. Correct? Is that a fair summary?
Correct.
Yeah.
And the default for this would be off, because otherwise we still have more state, which we probably don't want, right?
Right.
So this is primarily useful, the global option, when you don't own the type. If you own the type, yeah, you could just plop the attribute on every field.
Right.
Right.
Then the reason why JSON object was included, because if somebody has include fields on, but somebody doesn't want their own fields included, they will now have to like put JSON ignore on everything on all their fields for it not to be included, versus just like something top level saying, hey, don't include any of my fields. But I guess that's fine.
If you set this global option, it's possible, depending on the whole set of types you use, it's going to break your app. But people have to understand that if you enable global, public fields.
Again, JSON object as an attribute, it just doesn't scale with where you're opting in to ignore, because any future additions would have to be opt-in to include. And so then the argument of it lets you avoid JSON ignore is limited to exactly this release and doesn't stretch beyond. So I think that having a consistent story going forward is better than having a convenience in this release.
Yeah, and we can always add that later. It's totally optional.
Right. Okay.
So if I just remove the comments, this is what I currently have. So if we remove the JSON object attribute, what are we doing with the accessor? Should that be a setting on the JSON member attribute then, or how would that work?
The access. So if you put JSON member on something that has private accessors, that would also work the same way. You would use the non-public accessors.
Yeah, I
mean, like, why would we need it at all? Like, if I put on a property and the accessor happens to be private, isn't ignore
the
only sensible behavior?
No, we don't need that property. Ignore non-public accessors.
Right. I think that's the point, Emo, is by just putting the attribute on the property at all, you've said call both the getter and setter. I don't care what their declared access level was.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
And then so now I wasn't including private, like non-public fields or properties. So now JSON member attributes also apply to those.
Yeah, basically, so So you would only apply those two properties in fields, right? And so then if I want a private field to be serialized, I would put the attribute on it.
Yes.
The only thing you can't express right now is if this setting is on, I can't suppress a field. I guess I can, right? JSON
you can do
JSON. Yeah.
Which presumably right now doesn't say it applies to fields, so we need to update its attribute usage.
Yes, when field support is added.
Good point. That is a good point.
This all seems reasonable.
Yeah.
Okay, just to clarify though, that the original proposal only applied to properties if the property itself was public, and then of course the setter and getter can have either one of them anyway, could have a internal or private. So we're saying that now we're going to loosen that up, and it applies no matter what the property is declared as.
As long as it has to be declared with the type prior to compilation, then I don't care what you do.
Okay, well, I don't know if we have I don't know if we have scenarios for private setters and getters. It's normally just a setter, that's internal or private. I mean, I don't think we need to do that, but I don't know if we can change the behavior in the future or not. I haven't thought about it.
I would assume that if
C# will fail to compile if both setters if the property is public and both setters, both accessors are private, I think it fails to compile.
No, that's not.
Like at least one of I think one of them has to at least match the visibility.
Yes, that's correct.
So what do we do today for read-only properties? Are we basically serializing them on, but we don't deserialize them, right?
That's right. But
so
there's a feature option. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, and so if you want to serialize it, you would just put JSON member on the property, right? And now it would just serialize it. Now it would also deserialize it. Right, that's the way it would work.
By read-only, that you meant getter only. But so this one, so if it doesn't have a getter, then this one provides support because, there's no setter to use. You can use the parameterized constructor feature, or there's like a feature maybe post-5.0 where we say like object creation handling, where we can reuse the instance if it already is instantiated. But
so I'm not following. Like if you have a property that is read only, right? So it has a private setter, right? Today we would only serialize it, but we wouldn't deserialize it. Now if I want to deserialize it, I only have to put this JSON member attribute on it, and that would work, right?
Yes, that's right. I thought you were asking about if it didn't have a setter at all.
So if it doesn't have a setter at all, then I think it would basically do nothing, right? JSON member attribute it would still serialize it, but it wouldn't deserialize it, right? Because there's no way for us to call the code.
Right. And the only thing that I think you couldn't do easily is if you had an internal property that you wanted to serialize but not deserialize, and then the answer is make another internal property that only has the get, calls the get of the property that you care about, and put JSON member on that and JSON property name. Like you can work around it at that point. And I don't think we need to say, oh, this was a non-public get, but I want you to now do the read-only property scenario. Like, again, there's a workaround. So I don't think that's important.
Yeah, so my question now is, should we rename this attribute, though?
Because really, it feels like JSON include. Like it's the
I was about
to
suggest that, yes. I think that seems exactly what I just had in mind as well, yeah.
So that means
member just seems as an odd choice because we don't talk about members, right? In JSON, it's called a property, and member seems to be a .NET concept.
To be invalid to use.
Yeah, I think that it was called that way because we had one that was called class, so to differentiate the two. So if we don't have the class one, JSON include, that only applies to fields and properties. Makes sense.
Right.
So should it be invalid to have both JSON include and JSON ignore? Or like right now, JSON ignore wins over everything. So should we actively check for that and throw if you have both?
No, we should just use JSON ignore then. Because if you put both of them, I would say it's probably a bug on the developer side, but that I would probably serve with an analyzer if we cared enough. But at runtime, I would just say if JSON ignores specify, you don't deserialize it. That
or
is over.
Or throw an exception. But yeah,
we do throw invalid operation exception in other cases like this where we detect misuse of the attributes.
Like I think JSON property name null.
Mm-hmm. Yep. JSON extension data multiple stuff like that.
I think it's you can either go with ignore wins or throw whatever makes you happier. But include should lose. Deny always wins.
Okay. Probably throw.
All right, and Emo, don't forget the note that we need to update the attribute usage on JSON ignore.
Yeah, I'm literally typing that right now.
Thank you.
To include fields. And then,
so again, we're allowing private and internal properties and fields on this.
Seems like that's what you wanted.
Well, no, the original proposal was not that. I mean, in the sense of fields had to be public, and you had to have the property declared as being public. The setter and getter, one of them, being private.
I see what you're saying. Oh, so this maybe I read this wrong because it says non-public accessors and fields. So I kind of assumed you meant non-public fields.
Yes, I think you meant fields and non-public accessors.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, if there's no need to support privates, then I'm also okay with.
Yeah, nobody has asked for that. Well, one person asked for it, but.
Yeah, I mean, you can choose to, throw in the case where you see it applied to a thing that you didn't feel like writing down. But you shouldn't. You shouldn't if you decide you don't want to serialize private fields, even if they put JSON include, then you need to throw, because if you silently ignore it, you can't change your mind later.
Right.
So what is the other? Either say they said include this, and then say fine, I'll include it, or throw.
Yeah, definitely. Naomi, what are the other serializers support for private?
They do. You can use JSON property for Unity stuff to support this. That's why I know for Unity Soft, I think either UTF-8 JSON or I think it's UTF-8 JSON that allows you to use non-private members as well.
As long as there's not a type level directive that opts things in, as long as it has to be on each individual member, if you want it to include privates, I don't have an objection. It's weird, but I don't have an objection.
Yeah. I mean, there's the one or two people that would be very happy if we do this, but.
And you do you make sure you include tests with fields that are declared read-only and understand what you're going to do around that, because because I feel like instance fields already get blocked for set value if they were declared read-only, but I thought it was universal, but Levi says it's contextual, so trust him.
I think it was more people than me said that. But yeah.
Well, I would not make it contextual. I would just generally say the way we should treat read-only fields is get only properties, right?
Yeah, there's no setter whatsoever.
Yeah. So just make sure that we include a test that does that and that we've codified the behavior and yada yada yada.
I guess for the non-public stuff, I'll defer to Steve. Steve, do you think we should add non-public members? Or?
I mean, my only concern with non-public was the AOT scenarios, as Jeremy brought up already. I guess whether they're private or internal really doesn't matter. But if it becomes a common pattern, and now everyone starts doing it this way, then we're very constrained about what we can do for the code generation. I mean, basically the code generation converter has to live on that type. But by opening up it to non-public setters anyway, you kind of have the same problem, but it's just not going to be as pervasive, I think.
Yeah.
But as long as there's no security concerns, I thought there was.
If somebody's explicitly slapping the attribute on things, that's like that says write this in the payload, and I'm willing to accept that going on the wire because that's exactly what that's the same as them writing the converter and doing it manually.
Sure.
Okay, I think for now, if you put the attribute on non-public member, and then if at least that gives us the option to add it later versus like gets into a difficult spot now. It just depends on how many people want it.
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked at all the IL-emit behavior for privates. I'm assuming it's not going to be difficult. I mean, assuming we can do it, fine. But it's just a concern there.
Because if the IL-emit is dropping an assembly on the side, normal assembly load rules say if you had a field that was public and then you change it to private, somebody who was already calling the setter will get a CLR exception. Like it'll smack down and terminate the process. So you may have trouble with. You may not be able to ref emit those types. They might fall back to reflection only.
Right. So I guess that's a concern for perf anyway. But I guess if somebody's doing that, they probably have a good reason to do it. I mean, making private setters and getters and fields. So maybe they don't care about perf at that.
Yeah. But yeah, like as long as it's not silently, like if writing JSON include on a private field is not silently ignored, then you have expansion room.
Yep.
But if you silently ignore it in this release, then that's the behavior forever.
For sure. Oh yeah, there was one more proposal, but I like this one better anyway. So if this looks good, then
cool. Very happy. So I just put on the screen what I have written. Everybody agrees with that, then this is it for today. We're 20 minutes over, and we only reviewed 4 issues.
Cool.
That is awesome. A little bit depressing. At least we got to do all the blocking ones. I like it. All right, guys, then I say goodbye, and I see you next week.
All right. Thank you.